Good afternoon or morning, depending where you are joining us from today. My name is David Whaley, and I'm a partner at Thompson Hine in the Employee Benefits and Executive Compensation Practice Group. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars examining what this shift in presidential power could mean for the country, focusing on employee benefits. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. First, today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all of the attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. Second, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Third, we will be offering CLE credit for today's webinar. Please be sure to fill out and return the webinar affirmation form that can be found in the handout section of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. The form provides instructions as to where to send the completed form. You will need a tracking code, which I will announce at the end of the program. And finally, in the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios for today's speakers, myself and Dominic DeMatties. I'm delighted to introduce my co-presenter today, Dominic DeMatties, who's a partner in Thompson Hine's Employee Benefits and Compensation Group as well. Dominic is going to spend time covering some of the building blocks of the Biden administration's process for looking at retirement issues. And later in the presentation, I'm going to discuss health and welfare matters. So now, turn it over to Dominic for his conversation pertaining to building blocks on the retirement plan basis for the Biden administration.
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, I will start by touching on some priorities related to retirement and deferred compensation, and David will touch on priorities related to healthcare, and in particular, President Biden's expected stamp on Obamacare. Now, if you cheat forward, if you've downloaded any slides or cheat forward, not that I'm suggesting you do this, but you will see that David's slides are very nicely organized around the concept of elections have consequences. It's actually a perfect theme for our entire presentation and probably other presentations in this series. Our more recent experience with this phrase actually comes from President Obama, some of you may recall. It was in response to Republicans during a meeting during which there was a discussion of economic priorities shortly after he became president in 2009. He said, "Elections have consequences. I won." Of course, it was a little easier in 2009. President Obama had won a clear and overwhelming victory with an immediate concession, and his party controlled 60 seats in the Senate and a strong majority in the House. As we know, things are a little bit more difficult in 2021. President Biden did win the election by a healthy margin of popular vote, but a narrower margin in the Electoral College. At the time he won, it appeared the Republicans might retain control of the Senate, and they certainly did narrow the Democrat majority in the House. But after the Georgia runoffs, Democrats actually were able to take control of the Senate, having achieved the 50-50 Senate, with Vice President Harris now able to cast tie-breaking votes. So in this last cycle, election cycle, in a way, there really were two elections that mattered. The general election in November, and it had consequences, and the Georgia runoffs during early January, which actually carried a second set of consequences. The general election, of course, had consequences regarding control of the regulatory agenda. In our world, that's largely the focus and type of guidance we're likely to see from the Department of the Treasury, IRS, Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. But the Georgia runoffs had a different set of consequences for the legislative agenda. We could flip to the next slide. And one more. So the most significant consequence of the Georgia runoff elections from the perspective of retirement and deferred compensation legislation is what's likely to be prioritized. With Democrat control of the Senate, it's no surprise that legislation that represents Democrat priorities will be, front and center. In our view, this slide represents one of the first priorities likely to come up in the retirement space, which is to address multi-employer plans that are in poor financial shape. Now, multi-employer plans are often referred to and thought about as, say, union plans because they're maintained, and organized, pursuant to collective bargaining agreements. But they're actually sponsored by a joint board of employer and union representatives, or trustees, typically they're referred to. And some of you may know that multi-employer plans have experienced significant funding difficulties for a number of different reasons over the past 20 or more years. And in particular, with respect to multi-employer plans, because there are a number of them that are in difficult shape, the Multi-Employer Trust Fund, which is a trust fund maintained at the PBGC to pay benefits for multi-employer plans that have failed, is currently projected to run out of money by the year 2026. Now, this crisis has been on the horizon for at least 15 or 20 years, during which time both parties have had the presidency and both houses of Congress at the same time, but neither party has been able to pass a long-term solution to the issue. Some of you may be aware of, or are familiar with the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act, which did pass in 2014. That law allowed critical and declining multi-employer plans to make benefit cuts with the approval of the Secretary of the Treasury. However, the most significant failing plans have either been unable to or unwilling to use that law to cut benefits, and therefore it's widely been seen as failing to solve the problem. It's also been heavily criticized by many stakeholders because it has been seen as placing the financial burden of saving these retirement plans on the retirees by actually cutting their benefits. So what are we likely to see? The legislation, if we get it, is likely to repeal the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act, meaning no new benefit cut. It would provide PBGC with expanded authority to provide financial support for multi-employer plans that are projected to become insolvent. And it would restore the past cuts that were made under the benefit cut prior legislation. So if you're an employer who currently contributes to a multi-employer pension plan, what does it mean for you? Well, unlike some prior changes in law with respect to multi-employer plans, this one does not appear to come with increased contribution obligations. In other words, no surcharges, no additional increases required in contributions over and above what is collectively bargained. So no direct expense increase to contributing employers, at least not likely. But of course, it has to be paid for. Where does the money come from? So watch out for corporate and other tax increases, and the other part of this equation, which is the single employer pension funding relief. The way that the multi-employer relief is currently structured, and if something is to pass, what is likely to pass, would involve direct support from the Department of the Treasury, a cash infusion, basically, to PBGC to allow PBGC to provide financial support for plans so that those plans can remain solvent. Well, as a budgetary matter, at least to a certain extent, it's going to get paid for. Again, that may include corporate and other tax increases, but it also may include the single employer pension funding relief that's mentioned on this slide. So, what you have is really, one set of taxpayers who, is going to essentially pay for benefits for potentially another set of taxpayers, and that's kind of the way the system works. How does single employer pension funding work, and what does it mean? The way it would work is that an interest rate collar, which actually has been established under prior law, would be tightened. And what that means is that single employer pension plans would utilize a higher interest rate to determine their funding obligations. Higher interest rates generally, always mean lower liabilities unless there's other changes. So using the higher interest rates means that the contributions that are required to go into the plans would be lower. So if the legislation passes, required minimum funding contributions to single employer plans would likely decrease. And, the risk associated with insolvency and mass failure of a multi-employer pension plans would also decrease because those plans would be shored up. From a funding or from a perspective of pay for, if you will, lower contribution requirements means more assumed revenue. because pension contributions that otherwise would have been made on a tax-deductible basis are assumed to become taxable income to plan sponsors. So I think the main question remaining with this is, how is this likely to pass? Is this something that could pass on a bipartisan basis, which under current Senate rules, in the absence of eliminating the filibuster, would require 60 votes? Or would it pass under a different process, what we would think of, or what you may have heard referred to as the budget reconciliation process, which only requires 51 votes? Now, if you're following the news, you heard that the budget reconciliation process was initiated, I think it was yesterday or the day before, by Democrats. If this passes under budget reconciliation, then the legislative language that's been introduced in this Emergency Pension Plan Relief Act of 2021 that's referred to on this slide is likely to need to be modified to fit within the budget reconciliation process. So, we don't know what the future holds, but I don't think it will surprise anyone to hear me say that coming up with a filibuster-proof bipartisan majority in the Senate seems like a pretty tough thing to come by, especially for this type of legislation. So if this does move, it seems likely to be in the budget reconciliation bill. And perhaps this could go as quickly as part of the next coronavirus relief package, which may also move as a budget reconciliation bill, i.e. the same bill, within the next month or two. Next slide. So let's talk about some other initiatives with respect to legislation. This slide, I think I probably could have put a subtitle, What Could Have Been? So before the Georgia runoff elections and after the Biden victory, this slide would have been first. We would have been talking about, bipartisan legislation likely to pass and with strong support. But as a consequence of the Georgia runoff elections, our view is that the bipartisan legislation is likely to take a back seat. So these two bills that are referred to on this slide, each are co-authored and sponsored by a Democrat and Republican, often referred to collectively as Secure 2.0, because they follow up on the Secure Act that was passed at the end of 2019. These are not likely to be a high priority because Democrats, having a majority in both sides of Congress, are likely to move with their own priorities with their majority while they have it. But just an FYI, some of the things that are in these, because we may see this down the road.
Yeah, and Dominic, if I can chime in, one thing I think that's important is one of the bills that sort of becomes Secure 2.0 is actually the Portman-Cardin Act on the Senate side. And there is some question if there's a desire for Senator Portman to try to have some level of swan song legislation inside of his last 2 years, because as was, I think, noticed by many people, last week he announced that he was not running for re-election in 2 years. And so the question becomes, does his space become a desire to try to have a piece of legislation that is bipartisan and does have his stamp of approval, or does it become sort of a gridlock space where there is no such thing as bipartisan legislation, which will be, that fact of the Portman-Cardin bill has a chance to say maybe there are some legs with respect to this one as opposed to others.
Yeah, no, and it's a good point. And so referring by their sponsors, this first bill, Securing a Strong Retirement Act, some of you may have heard of this referred to as the Neil Brady bill, that's on the House side, and the Retirement Security and Savings Act, the Portman-Cardin on the Senate side. There's a lot of overlapping provisions in these two bills, including the bullets here, but they're not perfectly overlapping. And so, yeah, there's definitely a tension with respect to what's going to happen with Senator Portman retiring. It's interesting, from a certain perspective, you wonder whether a Senate Majority Leader Schumer is that interested in Senator Portman's legacy. And so, I don't know, that might sound a little harsh, but, this is politics after all. And so, it may or may not carry some weight, in particular to the extent that some of Schumer's co-members may decide, look, this is our best chance to get some things we're interested in getting. We don't know who's up next, or maybe eventually, obviously they will know who's up next, and I guess we probably could know who's likely to be up next. And so there's going to be a political calculation down the road regarding moving this. in any event, I do think this comes later if it comes, and I do think it comes later after Democrat priorities have been passed. And again, you see some of the provisions here, and we'll also talk about certain of the provisions that are not listed here that are actually likely to be plucked out from this legislation because they're essentially particular Democrat priorities that also either meet a certain policy objective and or may raise some revenue. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So this I guess this slide we could have subtitled "What is more likely to be?" What could have been, what is more likely to be. Well, we talked again about the first slide about the pension legislation. Next is likely these types of things. So savers credit. Well, there has been a strong interest in expanding the savers credit among Democrats and also some with Republicans, and including the fact that an expansion of the savers credit was included in both Neil Brady and Portman Cardin that were talked about in the last slide. So what is it? Well, the savers credit is currently a specified percentage. It ranges from 10 to 50% of retirement saving contributions up to $2,000. It's not indexed, made by people, lower income people based on their adjusted gross income. So there's bipartisan legislation. Again, it's included in both of the bills from the last slide that would raise this $2,000 credit to $3,000 and index it going forward and simplify the percentage. It's basically would become a 50%, a credit of up to 50% of retirement savings contributions. So why do I bring this up? I mean, this is an individual credit on an individual's tax return. Well, in addition to raising awareness of the issue, which some of you care about this from the perspective of your plan participants, there's another aspect to the savers credit that has not had bipartisan support, but has had strong Democrat support, and that is making the savers credit refundable and payable directly to a plan or an IRA. So this type of expansion of the savers credit, refundability, and having a mechanism whereby that refundable credit may be able to be passed through directly to a plan are more likely to move forward as a consequence of the Georgia runoff elections. The other aspect on this slide is increasing automatic savings. So, automatic savings have been a strong, we'll talk about this a little bit with the regulatory portion as well, but automatic savings initiatives have been strong priorities of a lot of Democrat policymakers for a long time. The Automatic Retirement Plan Act here was actually introduced by Chairman Neal in the House. And generally what it does is it says that employers with 10 employees would be required to maintain an automatic contribution plan, and failure to do so is enforced by an excise tax. It can be a qualified plan or an IRA type of arrangement. You can satisfy it. It would create a new kind of employee contribution only 401k plan with an $8,000 contribution limit. So for those of you who already have plans, generally you'd be exempt from this new requirement as long as your tax qualified plan has been maintained for 1 year prior to the date this is enacted, if it is enacted, and you have not amended that plan that you have in place to substantially decrease benefits, and this is a quote, in a manner that demonstrates an intent to avoid the purposes of the act. I don't know what that means, but presumably there would be some risk in the case of some decreases in benefits to watch out for. But generally, folks who have plans would be exempt. The important part about this is that, on a go-forward basis, this would preempt a lot of the state law initiatives. Some of you may be familiar with the state law initiatives on automatic IRA programs that have been put in place, California, Cal Savers, Oregon Saves, and there are others. The interesting thing about that is, those types of arrangements, I mean, they actually were born out of a federal budget proposal that goes back to at least 2009, the first year of the Obama administration, to create on a federal level so-called automatic IRAs, which is the second sub-bullet here in the bottom. And again, this has been a strong priority on the Democrat side of the aisle, at least for quite some time. But Republicans recoiled at that back in 2010, 2011, and you remember it's right on the heels of Obamacare passing because they saw it as an employer mandate, and employer mandates are generally not that popular with Republican stakeholders, and in particular in the aftermath of Obamacare. So so the automatic IRA programs didn't go anywhere. Now, the interesting thing about that is that ultimately the Obama administration ended up passing a rule, a Department of Labor regulation, that did seek to create kind of a path forward for these state arrangements by saying that they were not employee benefit plans under ERISA. And that rule was revoked by something called the Congressional Review Act, a disapproval, which we'll talk about more in a minute, when the Trump administration came in and the Republicans took control of Congress. So next slide with that. So along those lines, this slide we could call like what to watch out for, I guess. And let's start with Congressional Review Act, since I started to talk about it on the last slide. The Congressional Review Act, just briefly, it's an oversight tool that Congress has where Congress can overturn rules that are issued by federal agencies. So, under the Congressional Review Act, an agency must report the rulemaking activities to Congress and provides, Congress certain information regarding their rule. And then Congress has some procedures it can kick into place to decide whether or not it wants to overturn those rules. So the agency submits a report and copy of the rule and some other stuff. And then within a period of time, Congress can say, you know what, we're going to pass a joint resolution, so-called disapproving of the rule. And then that disapproval gets sent to the president to either be signed or vetoed. And if the president vetoes it, then the ordinary rules apply where Congress could override the veto. So we often see this come up toward the end of an administration when there's a change in party of the president and the new president's party holds a majority in the House and Senate. So the effect of a disapproval, if you will, under the Congressional Review Act is that the disapproved rule, quote, shall not take effect or continue. So it means that the rule is deemed to have never been in effect at any time. And even if a provision had become effective, it's retroactively negated. In addition, and this is the tricky part about Congressional Review Act, there's a rule in the act that says that the rule that has been disapproved may not be issued in substantially the same form ever again by the agency, unless it's specifically authorized by a subsequent law. So there is no definition of what it means to be substantially the same form. In addition, the Congressional Review Act prohibits judicial review of any determination, finding, or action or omission under the Congressional Review Act. So because of the unknown associated with these, what these things mean, substantially the same form and the judicial review uncertainty, as we walk through the regulatory portion of our presentations, you'll see that we don't really think there are likely candidates. And I think David will touch on this a little bit more. Wrapping up our legislative part of retirement, are the revenue raisers, of course. And so, there's a lot of these things have to get paid for. So how do they get paid for? Well, just a couple of things that we could see, and I'll hit these quickly because I think they're less likely. We could see an overall cap on benefits. There was an Obama era budget proposal for that. I think it was a $3 million cap, or actually I think it was slightly more complicated, but we could see some caps on benefits. We could see limits on highly compensated employees on their ability to make, say, for example, catch-up contributions, maybe Roth conversions. We could see reductions in the compensation limit. We could also see some tinkering with non-qualified deferred compensation. Some of you may recall a proposal by actually the Republicans, House Republicans in 2014, I think it was, from House Ways and Means, Dave Camp, chairman, which would have resulted in taxation at vesting for non-qualified deferred compensation, effectively doing away in large part with the regime. So with that genie out of the bottle from Republicans, there's really no reason to believe that it couldn't show up again. Next slide. So now we'll get on to the consequences on the regulatory front. And so we'll start, with the Department of Treasury. And just a note, here are the consequences. This is really a consequence, obviously, of the presidential election. Now, you may notice that I put legislation first, and often people kind of think of legislation a little bit as pie in the sky, or maybe it'll take a little longer. In this case, actually, on the retirement side at least, I think the legislation, in particular with respect to the pension funding issues that we talked about, is a short-term consequence, is likely to come up in the relative short term. And that some of these things for the regulatory agencies, at least on the retirement side, are longer term. So, thinking about some of these candidates, at least from the perspective of Treasury Department, focusing on the first one in particular, lump sum offers to retirees. You may recall back in the Obama administration, the IRS had published a notice that essentially said, and I'm translating, the 401A9 regulations allow a plan sponsor to amend its plan to provide a lump sum offer to retirees. That's kind of the first thing it said. The second thing it said is, we don't like that. We don't think that was really intended, and we don't like that result. And the way to read that, by the way, is the we in that case is really a policy perspective. It's Treasury putting its stamp on IRS saying, we don't like it and we want you to change the rule. And then it's IRS saying, yeah, okay, we think we have authority under the statute to change the rule. Because in that dynamic, the Department of Treasury looks at things like that from a policy perspective, which is when the administrations change, that policy perspective sometimes changes. Whereas the IRS, in particular the Office of Chief Counsel, looks at things from a legal perspective. Do we have authority to do this under the law? So when that notice was published in 2015, Treasury said we don't like it. IRS said we have authority under the law to change our regulations, and we're going to. Well, what happened? Well, there was an election, and that election had some consequences. And the Trump administration came in with its Treasury Department and said, we don't have a problem with lump sum offers to retirees. And so a notice was published in 2019 that said, you know what, we're just kidding. We're not going to amend the regulations. We know we said we were going to amend them, but we're not going to amend them. So we won't do it. But importantly, there's nothing in there that said that that they could not amend later on. There was nothing that precluded an amendment to the regulations. There was nothing that said we won't amend in the future. In fact, it just said we're going to study the issue. And it seems to me highly likely for those of you who have pension plans that we could see future action on this from Treasury and IRS saying, we've thought about it some more, and we've decided that we really don't like these lump sum offers, and we want to make some changes. Other things that we may see, the Democrat priority has frequently been, this idea of lifetime income. We've seen that in the Obama administration, and we're likely to see that going forward. And we're also likely to see initiatives that encourage automatic enrollment and auto escalation in 401k plans. By lifetime income initiatives, by the way, I mean encouraging payment of annuities or accumulation of annuities in, say, defined contribution plans. Next slide. So other things that we're likely to see, out of Treasury and the IRS, I know that they are working on Secure Act provisions. In particular, they're working on the long-time, part-time issues related to the provision from Secure that allows otherwise eligible employees who have 500 hours of service in 3 consecutive years to be allowed to at least provide for elective deferrals under the plans. Secure Act made some safe harbor plan changes, which, of course, are being are the subject of some regulatory guidance that will be coming. Secure Act also offered a closed plan non-discrimination and minimum participation relief for defined benefit plans. And interestingly, I think a lot of people thought Secure Act kind of spoke for itself. And I think some folks have kind of made some decisions regarding their plans based on the act it's alone without expecting any future guidance. However, we've heard directly from folks at IRS that they are working on guidance related to this provision. And so, that is in the pipeline. And we've also heard directly from people at IRS that they haven't received any stakeholder comments. And what that means is that they don't really know what the sensitivities or issues are. And that can sometimes lead to proposed rules, at least, that sometimes get interesting because they're just kind of thinking of the issues themselves as opposed to having a pipeline to the stakeholders. Secure Act also made changes to required minimum distributions, which we will see as part of the future. The partial termination relief rule that showed up in the end of year bill last year is also subject to something that we know the IRS is working on. Next slide. So other items, Treasury is working on vesting rules, hybrid plan rules, governmental plans. Electronic delivery and missing participants are always interesting things that they will continue to work on in connection with the Department of Labor. And then we have some 409 Cap A and 457F rules that were proposed in 2016, and actually some earlier proposed rules that at some point in time we will see finalized. I think these are all likely longer term projects. David will be happy to hear that they're also working on ESOP regulations. They promise that even though that project has disappeared from the business plan, that they haven't dropped it altogether.
I just heard it sitting on somebody's desk.
It's sitting on somebody's desk. Yes, we're not allowed to say who. Yeah, it's sitting on somebody's desk. So, turning out to the Department of Labor, a lot of this stuff, the Treasury too. I mean, it's a little clear on the Treasury side, but ultimately what the priorities will be, at least the political priorities, are going to depend on the political appointees. And, we really don't have political appointees, obviously, not at the deputy assistant secretary level or at the assistant secretary level in the case of either tax policy at Treasury or EBSA at Labor. So we really don't exactly know, obviously, what the priorities may be for the individual people who will be coming in. But for Labor, I think some things are just a little bit clearer. And I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly so I can make sure David gets his time. But Fiduciary Rule Part 3. I mean, so we've seen this saga before. When administrations come in, they, have what's called the regulatory freeze memorandum, which essentially says, look, anything that's not yet effective, consider delaying the effective date. They send this out to the agencies, by the way. They say anything that's not yet effective, consider delaying the effective date. Anything that has been sent to the Federal Register but not published, pull it back. Essentially, it puts a freeze. And we saw this play out at the beginning of the prior administration with respect to, of all things, the fiduciary rule, which at that time was originally scheduled to become effective in April of 2017. The administration delayed it until June of 2017 and then ended up making some changes. And then ultimately, through case law, that the fiduciary rule was vacated by the Fifth Circuit. Well, we've got something very similar going on now. We've got it took 4 years, but finally the Trump administration came up with something with respect to the fiduciary rule. They reinstated the traditional 1975 five-part test and put in a privileged transaction exemption with respect to investment advice fiduciaries. But that's not yet effective. And so that is subject of the regulatory freeze memorandum. And I don't think we will ever see that be effective. It is likely to be revisited. And I would be surprised, in fact, if the Biden administration folks don't try to go back to something that looks a lot more like the Obama era fiduciary rule. They're also likely to revisit electronic delivery. There was a rule published quite some time ago now by the Trump administration. And, I don't think the whole thing gets thrown out, but I think it is likely that at least some paper requirements are restored.
Well, and it's interesting, if I can steal a second here, because when we talk about on the next, and I'll go to the next slide, you have this more verbose electronic delivery rule that the Department of Labor pushed through. And then you get guidance, missing participant guidance, that's pretty soft guidance that leans very heavily into that electronic disclosure rule to be able to keep from losing participants. And then the reaction is that it's quite possibly that rule is going to get winnowed down. So you lead right back into the other priorities that Labor has, because this best practices guidance that the Department of Labor put out really leaned into the rule that now is going to get winnowed.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a vicious circle. And speaking of that missing participant guidance, if you will, I mean, I hadn't planned to get too much into it because, I guess it's on this slide, so we can get into it a little bit. This best practices document, I mean, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Labor does with this going forward, because there have been a number of competing proposals relating to missing participants, including some proposals on the Hill that, had attempted to set up, say, kind of lost and found registries or to do other things The missing participant problem really has challenged administrations of both parties. Starting out, really the problem goes back so far that we could have spent hours talking about just that. But at least in the modern thinking of it, it goes back to at least 2005 or six, where there was a Department of Labor audit, initiative related to missing participants. And the idea was that, we're going to find out how much noncompliance there is. Well, they found out there was, in their view, a lot of noncompliance and that there was a lot of money to be so-called recovered. And it became something that where essentially law was being made through folklore, through investigation initiatives, as opposed to, through any guidance, or in particular notice and comment guidance. And so, the truth is that I don't see them solving that. And it would seem to me we'd probably need to have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate and probably have some legislation if it's ever going to get fixed.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of leaves our employers, and I'm just to take 2 seconds on it, that the only advice we really can give is make sure you have a policy, because it seems that from the best practices of not having a written policy is probably a de facto problem.
Right. I think that's right. And what's very difficult about that is that when we say have a policy, what we generally mean is a policy that for the most part, you've got a service provider who's going to carry out for you. And in some cases, multiple service providers, because there's different pieces being done by different folks. And it can really leave a heavy burden on the in-house people, if you will, with respect to plan administration, company employees, HR folks, and others who are trying to coordinate all this stuff in terms of ensuring that it's actually happening and that each of the individual service providers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which leads to the biggest problem of all of having a policy, which is if it's not followed. Because essentially the Department of Labor takes the view that it's a per se breach of fiduciary duty. If they come in and ask for your policy, they look at your policy and then they find out that you haven't been following it. So it does lead itself into a kind of a vicious potential cycle here as we continue. I think we're going to continue to see these missing participant investigations, which have expanded into cybersecurity and data security as well. And in addition to some of the case law there, I think that will be a continued initiative of the Department of Labor. Just a couple things to mention here: the BSG regs and the proxy voting regs. One has been finalized, and one is, I think they've both been finalized actually. But in any case, I expect those to be revisited, but likely through notice and comment rulemaking that we'll see play out over the next, 6, 10, 12, 18 months. But I do expect to see them revisited. And I think the proxy voting one may actually be potentially subject to the regulatory freeze. Next slide. I think I'm done.
Thanks, Dominic. I really appreciate it. Thanks for letting me chime in some too there. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about Obamacare and healthcare generally, but really what we're seeing here is this Biden fingerprints on Obamacare. So much of the new administration is really attempting to demonstrate how the new administration is not the Obama administration. Great example of this was listening to a podcast this morning pertaining to discussions of the Biden administration and how much further they are pushing on environmental issues than the Obama administration, to be able to show their differentiation from what the prior administration that President Biden was a part of. We're not seeing that as much inside of healthcare. And the reason why we're not seeing as much inside of healthcare is that it took so long for any modification of the delivery of healthcare in this country to get modified through Obamacare. And it actually, you could argue, cost the 2010 election to Democrats, that there's not a strong desire to modify on wholesale the process by which healthcare is being delivered. Instead, we're trying to figure out where those spaces and places that the fingerprints of the Biden administration can be put on Obamacare to continue to tweak, continue to move forward. Again, as Dominic started with, elections have consequences. And I like to think about this. I'm going to do a little bit of the inverse order that Dominic did, that there's short-term consequences, executive actions or Congressional Review Act. their midterm consequences, sub-regulatory guidance, or notice and rulemaking guidance, and then long-term consequences, what legislative proposals are out there. And doing that in a little bit of inverse order, because the legislative proposals are the most challenging, partially because modifications to the Affordable Care Act have a real hard time being squeezed into a reconciliation bill. And second, there are only 2 reconciliation bills a year that can get through Capitol Hill. And so whenever you have them, they become Christmas trees that you end up having to hang enough on, but not so much that the tree falls over. So executive actions. When we're looking at executive actions of the Biden administration inside of health planning and welfare plans, we really see 2 things that we can end up really going at from an executive space. The first has already happened. Inside of the first 7 days of executive actions, you saw President Biden expand the ability of individuals to get into healthcare.gov for a period from February 15th through May 15th, so that individuals can be able to get access to insurance outside of the regular open enrollment period. Why is this? Argument is being made that it's because of the pandemic. Individuals need access to healthcare, but the real answer to this comes that the CMS was really hamstrung with respect to its ability to market the exchanges to individuals who could otherwise participate in those exchanges. A great take whenever the first rollout of the marketplaces, these exchanges, was taking place, was you had President Obama going on to Zach Galifianakis's website, Funny or Die, to do an interview between 2 ferns. That marketing was more than the Trump administration did entirely with respect to the past year. And so the Biden administration says, we're going to actually open up a 3-month period, and we're going to spend $50 million on outreach marketing to make sure individuals have the opportunity and knowledge to be able to sign up for exchange plans. 36 states underneath the federal system, the non-federal states, almost all are expected to join. There may be a holdout with respect to the opening up of the special enrollment periods. So that's something we've seen already, and something from an executive branch we will continue to see. We're going to continue to see the White House pushing for the open enrollment periods, expanding the ability of people to get access to exchange coverage. Second thing that you can end up having from an executive action are the review of the ACA and Medicaid waivers that were granted by the Trump administration. The Trump administration granted 1332 waivers to many states with respect to various aspects of the way in which they offer their products inside of the exchange and outside of the exchange. And the goal of this was really to alleviate the Affordable Care Act obligations against the states. Those waivers each either have their own termination provisions, not set dates, but things in which the administration can do to terminate, or they have mandated requirements that the states have to follow to continue to obtain the waiver. We can very much believe that the Biden administration is going to look at the termination provisions with respect to those. Even furthermore, the Fifth Circuit has a lawsuit going on now that the Biden administration is going to have to evaluate that actually attempts to strike down the whole of multiples of those group waivers that were granted to states. So you immediately see executive actions into the Affordable Care Act driving the Biden fingerprints on Obamacare. Second, we get to the Congressional Review Act, and we're going to say or other means. And as Dominic pointed out, that the Congressional Review Act is the ability of Congress with the signature of the president to be able to overturn regulatory actions that were taken in a window before the time the congressional action is taken. And so it gives Congress and the president the ability to take down an old administration's regulation so that they can imprint their own desires. Now, we don't end up seeing a lot of conversation pertaining to the Congressional Review Act being able to repeal or desiring to repeal many of the Trump administration's regulations, and realistically, I think for 2 reasons. The first of those reasons is you have a president that was elected on a message of unity. And that message of unity is very challenging to say that you're working together in unity when the first thing you do is have a set of regulations that you are repealing through congressional action. And so it becomes a hard get. The second thing is, while CRA actions are typically not subject to filibuster, they still do require 50 votes, which requires the whole of the Democratic caucus inside of the Senate to vote to repeal a regulation. And you end up having senators who are actually being charged by their constituents to have this question about, well, how much were you driven at unity when one of the first votes you took was to repeal a slew of regulations that were from the prior administration? So that's the first reason why I just don't think we're going to end up seeing why we don't believe there's really a CRA challenge. The second reason actually ends up being is that the notice and comment rulemaking process is such that probably a sufficient means to the Biden administration to be able to overturn the Trump administration's actions. And in the health space, it's actually very helped by the passage of the Consolidation Appropriations Act by President Trump in 2021. The CAA had, and we're not going to dig into it, but it had 3-4 different spaces at which it attacked transparency and drug pricing and mental health parity as well inside of group health plans and insurer products. And so we have this new legislation that's going to be subject to new regulation to try to implement those rules inside of our group health plans, inside of our insurance products, and among pharmacy benefit managers and contracting parties. Well, if you look at this list of 6 items, the insurer transparency rule is designed to disclose cost sharing online for online self-service to individuals. That's a part of the CAA. No, not exactly the same, but it's a part of the CAA. So there's not a lot of reason to go after a regulation that people and individuals might disagree with. And we have a law that now we get to enact a regulation that incorporates that law to be able to take over what is the insurer transparency rule. Drug rebate pricing rule, trying to move rebates to point of sale. Part of the CAA is to actually make drug rebates much more transparent to the entire process. And so you now have a vehicle in which you can issue notice and comment rulemaking to overturn the drug rebate pricing rule. Most favored nation drug pricing for Medicare Part B actually modifies the payment under Medicare Part B for what the average amounts that are paid in foreign countries are for drugs to be able to modify this system. Again, we have some tools and items inside the CAA and otherwise to be able to modify these rules. Also, we have some legislative priorities we're going to talk about in a minute with respect to specifically drug pricing. Now, where are the spaces that CRA or notice and comment rulemaking as a part of the CAA doesn't seem to hold up enough? Well, we probably end up at grandfather group health plans' ability to charge higher costs. Now, the question becomes, does the Biden administration just issue notice and comment rulemaking to revoke the modifications that were taken by the Trump administration, or do they just allow the grandfather health plans, which aren't that numerous, to continue? And so that becomes the question that really the Biden administration will end up have to tackle to try to figure out how they deal with something that they disagree with. The final on this is actually the EEOC wellness regulation. Now, this becomes the challenge with respect to the EEOC is not a direct executive branch office. And since it's not a direct executive branch office, we end up in a space that the EEOC is likely to make up. It's a 5-member panel is made up of currently of 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, likely to become 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans in 2022. That becomes the moment and opportunity for notice and comment rulemaking to be able to modify the EEOC positions, potentially with respect to the wellness regulations. And so we end up in a place that we're really looking at notice and comment rulemaking with respect to the majority of things that were otherwise attacked or by the Democrats inside of elections that were accomplished with respect to health and welfare. Now, what can we do inside of that space? Not only as we wait for notice and comment rulemaking, probably an 18 to 24-month process, maybe even it's as fast as an 18 to 24-month process, but we can end up having non-enforcement policies that are adopted by the Biden administration and by the departments underneath in the Biden administration to accomplish basically saying, yeah, that's a rule, but we're not going to enforce it. Second, we end up with modified participation in the litigation. And this is a really big one with respect to not only the matters that follow, but also with respect to the Medicare waivers. I noted before that there was a Fifth Circuit litigation on Medicaid and ACA waivers. Well, the defender of the waivers was the federal government, the Trump administration. Now, suddenly inside of that litigation, the defender is not going to be the White House, because the White House is not going to fight for that which they otherwise want to repeal. And so there either needs to be the states defending themselves, they want their waivers, and or potentially the minority position of the House taking up that cause to try to assert that the waivers are valid. We end up having this spot that all of a sudden the Biden administration can pull back from the litigation that was sought by the Trump administration in defense of some of these regulations to allow the courts to strike them down. Because if they don't have the weight of the White House behind them, maybe they disappear. So you end up with some modification and participation in litigation. Second, we end up with just notice and comment rulemaking. Now, the two biggest factors that we end up seeing inside of notice and comment rulemaking that were accomplished by the Trump administration inside of health and welfare that are likely to be attacked are association health plans and short-term limited duration health insurance policies, both of which are programs that the Trump administration created to largely get around the community group rating requirements for individual and small group policy programs inside of the Affordable Care Act. Both of these pieces of regulation have gone through litigation or are going through litigation. The short-term limited duration health insurance policies is actually on appeal to a full in-bank panel of the DC Circuit Court. But right now, the standing is such that that regulation is allowed to stand. Probably likely to see a Biden administration go through notice and comment rulemaking to remove short-term limited duration health insurance policies. Association health plans, on the other hand, are still before the circuit court in the DC circuit, and there's waiting now, I think, 15 months for the decision following the oral arguments with respect to that matter, wondering whether or not the Biden administration issues notice and comment rulemaking to repeal that regulation so as to maybe cause the court decision in the DC circuit court to be mooted out, where we don't even have to deal with or get a decision on the determination of association health plans. So then we get to long-term consequences, right? So we've talked about these short-term consequences, notice and comment rulemaking, potential executive action. Can we try to figure out ways to modify through legislative or changes in legislative positions the ability to move forward on health and welfare matters? Not really Congressional Review Act matters, probably more traditional administrative law practices. So the long-term consequences, legislation. Now, we end up starting with, and the thing I did not put on the slide because I don't believe that it is a Biden administration desire, as you saw play through the Democratic primaries, is Medicare for all. That you end up in this space of a Biden administration has not announced or a desire, even through elections, to say that they are for Medicare for all. Partially because, again, Biden's goal is to actually put his fingerprints on Obamacare, not modify Obamacare entirely, but to start making modifications to make it work better. The one thing that you did see the Biden campaign consistently through primaries and through the general election say is that they wanted to have a public option within the exchange. If you remember during the 2009 and 10 window, when we were debating the Affordable Care Act, the inclusion of a public option was a very hotly debated factor. It was one of the factors that actually Democrats did not get in the creation of the Affordable Care Act that I think they very much would have liked to have had. The public option being a theory that you can sell functionally policies that are available to federal employees in the exchange. The concern with respect to these from a Republican standpoint is that's one step away from Medicare for all. Now, one could argue that Medicare is one step away from Medicare for all, more than a public option inside of an exchange. But what you're really getting to is this expansion of consolidated coverage to the masses through some platform, the exchange. Now, again, that's very likely to not be able to be allowed through a reconciliation process. So you probably need 60 votes in the Senate to get that through. So absent a filibuster being eliminated, it's very unlikely to occur. What are some other spaces? Now, increased subsidies. The thought is to be able to increase subsidies for both those individuals that are below 150% of the federal poverty line and above the 400% of the poverty line. Really modifying not only the amount of the subsidy, so as to requiring individuals to pay less of their adjusted gross income for policies, but also expanding the crowd of people who get this premium subsidy to go below 150% of the federal poverty line and to go above 400% of the federal poverty line, really trying to make it a bigger pot of pie. Now, interestingly, direct revenue raising factors. These are factors that pertain to people's taxes and very well can be in a reconciliation program. It'll be interesting to see that if the process pertaining to COVID relief becomes a reconciliation Christmas tree that things get hung on, does an increased subsidy provision either for all time or for just during the pandemic window get added into that bill? Then finally, the biggest thing we end up talking about was something I talked about in the regulations before, is this group negotiation of Medicare and or federal health plan drug prices. There's been a large conversation from the Biden administration and from Democrats and individuals altogether inside of think tanks that look at healthcare about trying to figure out a way to group buy drugs for large populations, maybe the whole of the United States, to be able to leverage the negotiation power of the United States with respect to the drug buying process. Interestingly, if you think about it, it's a little bit about what's happening with the vaccine for COVID right now. Right now, the COVID vaccine is being 100% paid for, the shot itself, by the federal government. The negotiation of the prices for that vaccine are with each of Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. They're direct contracts between the federal government and those entities saying, we will pay X amount per shot. Not materially different, just the scale of what's being offered, all drugs, as opposed to one particular drug. And the question becomes, is it something that the federal government gets into the business of starting to be able to group negotiate those drugs so as to be able to lower prices? Intriguing, one of the regulations that I did pass over a little bit, largely because it's probably in violation of, oddly, Canadian law, was an ability of plans to be able, the federal government to be able to re-import drugs from Canada so as to obtain lower prices for those drugs as sold in America. Now, there's a humor with respect to this because Canada does group purchase their drugs, and as a group purchasing of their drugs, they obtain lower cost with respect to every drug that is then purchased and sold in Canada. So intriguing that it is not allowable for the United States to do as much group purchasing, but we, underneath regulation, we're allowed to re-import that same drug from Canada, which does group pricing. Canada is very likely to block the application to the extent the Biden administration does not block the regulation, because they're very concerned that if that occurs, that re-importation occurs, their prices are going to go up because the deals they struck are not for their citizens alone, first of all, but even beyond that. The deals they struck are for a delivery of an amount of drugs that's significantly in excess of the amount that was underneath the agreed to negotiation. It functionally puts Canada in the space of negotiating for the US government, which is both an incorrect space from a policy perspective, one could say, but also something that the Canadian government is very unlikely to care about or take up. And so as a part of that, the regulation is likely to be illegal under Canadian grounds and therefore inapplicable and unable to be used. So that's what we're looking at as a transition, a presidential change and benefit building blocks of the Biden administration. Again, really sort of a subtext here that elections have consequences and that you end up seeing those consequences run through retirement plans and through health plans. And it'll be interesting to see what the next 2 and 4 years end up taking us with respect to legislative, regulatory, or executive action. Really, thank you for your time today. We actually had been watching for questions, and I don't know that any questions had popped in. So we're up against the hour. Wanted to make sure that everybody does have that once CLE is able to get CLE. The tracking code for CLE is CLE FEB2. That's the same as CLE February 2. So you're able to download that form from the handout section and be able to fill out the form to claim your CLE. Since we haven't had any questions, if there are additional questions after today's webinar, please feel free to email or call your current Thompson Hine attorney, or call myself or Dominic directly. You can see our email addresses here on the website. If you're not a current Thompson Hine contact, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dominic so we can help and make sure that we are able to assist you and your entities as you move through this presidential change. Thanks so much for your time today.